Thanks again to our sponsor, Kyndryl, who runs and reimagines the technology systems that drive advantage for the world's leading businesses. With a unique blend of AI-powered consulting built on unmatched managed service capability, Kyndryl helps leaders harness the power of technology for smarter decisions, faster innovation, and a lasting competitive edge. You can find so many previous guests from the Innovation Show, Sanjeet Paul Chowdhury, Rita McGrath, on kindle.com/institute. It's the anniversary of that institute. It's packed full of great thought leaders. Don't forget, you can download the app as well and subscribe to content there. You can find that at kyndryl/institute. We said that we'd come back to Chuck's rulebook, how to be an entrepreneur inside an organization, 7 rules. And actually, there's a hidden rule there as well that we'll tell you about in a moment. And then the 7 rules of how to manage entrepreneurs as well. It is a pleasure to welcome back for our grand finale, author of Permission Denied, the Odysseus of entrepreneurship himself, Chuck House. Welcome back to the show.
Hey, thank you, Aidan. I really appreciate this continuation of quite a story together. It's been fun. And one of the questions I've been getting, you've put some of these out on podcasts, and I've got some fairly interesting comments back. And one has to do with the difference between an entrepreneur and an intrapreneur. And the obvious one is that an entrepreneur is building their own company and is starting with essentially a fresh slate, if you will. And an intrapreneur is actually doing the work inside a corporation. And so the place you appeal to for funding, the place you use for your marketing team, et cetera, is the corporation's team, not your own group that you've built up. And a lot of people say, well, entrepreneurship is a lot more fun. Let's talk about that. But the facts are, most of us spend most of our lives as intrapreneurs or, working for someone else. Then I'll give you an example. When Steve Jobs did the first iPhone, that was entrepreneurial. Or when he did the first, Apple II would be a better example. But consider the Apple's iPhone 17 was just released. iPhone 2, 3, 4, all the way through 17. Every one of those is an intrapreneurial project, not an entrepreneurial project. So the entrepreneurial rules are really pertinent to many more people than the entrepreneurial rules. And we don't cast it that way. And so to me, this is almost an undiscovered segment of learning and of leadership and issues that every corporation with almost all their employees has to deal with. But we don't cast it that way. We have courses in how to be the leader. We don't have courses in how to do these basically blocking and tackling issues for corporations. So that's really part of the point of these rules.
And one of the things that happened for you is, I just want to remind those people, maybe you're joining us afresh, you haven't heard the rest of the story. That's okay, because these rules will work for you regardless. But we may refer to some of the instances from the book and the experiences that Chuck had. One of them was the relative freedom you had in Colorado Springs in Hewlett-Packard, the air cover you had from your manager. Then you were essentially headhunted to a career in corporate engineering at HQ in Palo Alto, which seems like promotion, Chuck. But with it comes a drawback, and the drawback is now maybe you're not an entrepreneur, maybe you're part of an entrepreneur team, and more you're a manager of entrepreneurs, which is a totally different thing. It's like that idea of the Peter Principle. So you develop two things: the Intrapreneuring Manager's Rule Book, but also the Intrapreneur Rule Book. And I'm going to set this up for you, and we're going to go through the 7 rules of each. And actually, as I said, there's a hidden rule as well, an important one. But for the rule book for entrepreneurs, you say the entrepreneur, by contrast to the entrepreneur, has just one source of finance. That is his or her company. The company has to back you. Entrepreneurs don't start companies, they work at them. And if that doesn't work, then what? I thought then you check your brain at the door if you want to keep your job. But as an entrepreneur, you are perennially selling yourself, both inside and outside the company. And you benefited from a manager who gave you air cover, as I said, back in Colorado, but you didn't have that anymore. So you had to develop these rules, 7 rules, to describe important leadership choices by which an entrepreneur can operate. with heavy emphasis on rapid fire exploratory activity, always testing your thesis on a desired audience, perpetually asking why of your team and of your company's approach. But more fundamentally, the rules require a clear focus on a goal, the contribution to be made, and on specific things that are crucial to success, using your team, honoring your supporters, and knowing the territory deeply in terms of feature, needs, and competition. So, with that, let's share the Intrapreneur's Handbook. Over to you to start.
It sounds like you wrote the book, and I love it. It sounds very good listening to someone else describe it. Yeah. So the first topic are the entrepreneur's rules, and I basically list them here. I list all seven here, but I'll take them in turn. The first one is make a contribution, and the point of this came from Bill Hewlett directly. It was, we are not looking for incremental improvement. We're looking for fundamental change. And the metric we used to use is if it's 10 times better, that's probably significant. If it's 20% better, that's a very small incremental improvement. And so the question is, if you come up with something that's 10 times better, almost by definition, it gets rid of what was prior. So you've almost immediately built a dichotomy where what you're going to do deletes everything you've done. And you can imagine not everyone is thrilled with that. A lot of the people busy with today's projects think that's really kind of crazy. They can do incremental improvement easily. It's almost like, well, let me give you an example that we would all know, and that is Apple pioneered computing, and then they did music with the iPod. And then somebody said, well, if you could do music and a computer, couldn't you do both in one device? And we'll call that a phone. And they built the iPhone, and it got completely ridiculed in Silicon Valley, and especially by Motorola and the Finnish company building phones, on the basis that the sound quality of the telephone call wasn't that good. And Apple is saying, well, but it's good enough. It's good enough, but you also get music and you also get computing and you get the web, and yeah, but the phone quality isn't any good. I was in meetings at Motorola where the entire executive team was complaining that this thing wasn't a good phone and missing the point of the contribution that it was. So I say make a contribution that's big enough to have impact. And one of the ways you can tell how much impact it has is by how many people it stirs the emotions.
There's a couple of threads I'd love to pull at here, and reading these ideas sparked for me. And one of the things you wrote was to really empower other people, you have to allow them space and time to make their own mistakes and learn their own lessons, but especially to imbue their own passion into the task at hand. This advice also holds for your bosses, many of whom may seem recalcitrant, unenthusiastic, or downright hostile to some or many of your ideas. And you go on to say, many of us make the mistake of seeing them as the enemy. And we'll come back to that because that's one of the rules. But I just thought about this idea and I wondered this ever happened to you. I shared this on a LinkedIn post. In the book 48 Laws of Power, Robert Greene says we should never outshine our bosses. And he quotes, I'm quoting him here, he said, everyone has insecurities. And when you show yourself in the world and display your talents, you naturally stir up all kinds of resentment, envy, and other manifestations of insecurity. This is to be expected, he says. You cannot spend your life worrying about the petty feelings of others. With those above you, though, you must take a different approach. When it comes to power, outshining the master is perhaps the worst mistake you can ever make. That came to mind at this point because I'm sure you've done that, where there was corporate jealousy, especially the times when you were being celebrated on the magazines as well.
I love that set of points, and we'll talk about that. So, point 7 of this says honor your bosses. The original book titled Intrapreneuring by Gifford Pinchot III, set the whole stage for this. And that sort of, he took a picture of my Medal of Defiance with a Polaroid camera. I threw the damn award away. I thought it was a gag gift. And The only reason the world knows about it is his polarized shot. But in his book, he specifically says you need to honor your sponsors. And I changed it in this one to honor your bosses, because the point you just made is accurate. What happens, so Gifford's view was honor those people who gave you the air cover, who gave you the sponsorship. That's great. Okay. Obviously you want to honor those. But if you don't honor your bosses, you basically are sawing yourself off a limb in a tree. And I think the quote you just gave is perfect. For an entrepreneur, the bosses are your lifeblood. That is it. And if you anger them to the point they don't choose to fund you, game over. And so yeah, I would absolutely subscribe to that point. Who's the
I
name of that author again?
Robert Greene, so he writes books on military strategy,
Okay.
and this book is called The
I
48
don't know
Laws of
him, but
Power.
he held that one pretty well.
Yeah, I know. When I read it, I was like, "Oh no, that happens in organizations all the time." But you shared a great example, and this was honoring the Palo Alto leadership who forced you to enter the product development system business, so the PDS.
Right.
They weren't high on your list of favorite folk, you say, and you spent considerable time debating how to sell your bold new PDS definitions. The solution, though, was to honor those Palo Alto bosses by inviting a wide coterie of their trusted lieutenants and creatively and actively engaging with those visitors on the merits of our program rather than spending time on charter flights, territorial imperatives, or past history of various divisional slights. So I thought this was important because you brought them in and you made them part of it. And in a way, you made them look like the heroes.
In the book, the first project I described was the Displays project. And at the end of it, I gave a fairly passionate discussion about what happens with a new, and we had a bunch of people from Bell Laboratories visiting, and a nice venue to have a great speech. And I gave this talk about when you have a great idea, people ridicule it or ignore it, and then they try to change it, and then they claim credit eventually. So it was that little tongue-in-cheek thing. And walking out of the meeting, my Dar Howard, the second level boss, put his arm around me. He said, "My God," he said, "you are an incredible public speaker." He said, "That was a fantastic speech. It would be good enough to be on television. In fact, I think that'd be a good place for you to be spending your next career." And he took me out of my job because I basically had blistered him and his, I'd basically thrown both of my bosses under the bus. So I got an opportunity to be an individual contributor for a while. Thank you very much. When Logic hit that same phase, my conclusion was we have to teach a seminar to them. And we put a 25-hour, 10 sessions of 2.5 hours each together to teach them about the technologies that were now happening. And what happened was now they become part of the story. And it took a while, and they were pretty, you talk about recalcitrant. I don't use that word in most conversations, but I did write it. And they moved from being, really antagonistic to becoming understanding and supportive. They didn't want to manage it themselves, but they understood why we needed the resource and why we needed the path we were following. And it changed everything. And then when Pisces happened, the issue there was we were ordered to do that by Palo Alto, which rankled me a fair amount. And it took a while to realize it was actually an opportunity rather than, it's one of those things, when given lemons, you ought to worry about lemonade. But when we were done, we had solved a problem that the whole corporation had at two levels. One was the project solved a real competitive problem between HP and Intel, which at the time were fiercely competitive. But more importantly, HP had not learned how to manage the systems business. We were a products company, not a systems company. And what we did with Pisces was build a 14 division consortium to build a systems quality product. And Palo Alto, when they understood that, that's why I got the nod to go to Palo Alto. Was now that was not my plan. I didn't sit down and say I'd like a ticket to Palo Alto. In fact, that was the enemy as far as I was concerned. But I couldn't treat them that way because really we formed a partnership around new ideas, and that I think that's a crucial thing that the entrepreneurs have a hard time learning.
So we've done 1 and 7. So number 2 is do your own market research. And I have shared the story of you doing this to so many people where you'd built the XY display box. So this is what gives us computer screens today.
Right.
This is the prototype essentially. But as you say, there was a tepid response from your home division from marketing who almost killed it. But you got it out into the field. You took it out into the world and showed it to people, and you had 20 customers, enthusiasts lined up all of a sudden. So the key of you doing that work versus handing it to somebody else who probably doesn't really deeply understand it, but also doesn't really understand how to present it to people is absolutely key.
That's true. And I can think of several other examples. When we started the logic business, the same thing. This talks to two things. One is do your own research and use your team. We Our conclusion was we didn't know. We were analog circuit designers, basically. That's what oscilloscopes was, and we're purporting to build tools that will measure digital signals. Well, we didn't have any digital designers, so we had to go see them. And the notion was, how many do you want to see? And I had a team of 20, and I said every person has to spend a week in front of a digital designer somewhere this year. Come home and describe what you saw. And what happened was we got, people who went out and saw TTL logic, they saw ECL logic, they saw low frequency, high frequency, intermediate frequency, they saw synchronized systems and asynchronous systems. And so it was a cacophony of conflicting kinds of data. But as you listen to the set of people, we were able to coalesce around something that none of us understood. It's the Indian proverb about the elephant. One guy's got the trunk, and one guy's got the leg, and one the tail, and they're all trying to describe something imperfectly for just the piece they saw. And so my point about do your own market research is you've got to be part of that research in the field so that you have some way to ascertain truth versus bullshit. But if it's a big problem, you've got to use the whole team to do it. And the beauty of that is the whole team then together will kind of start to share the same viewpoint. You're bringing them along faster than you would if you did the work all by yourself and then tried to explain it to them. It's a nuance, but it's an important one. The know your competitors, I'll tie in there because one of the best ways to do things is to find out where they're successful and why they're successful. We had the good fortune to actually stand in one of our competitors' booths for a day and show their new product to their potential customers. And I mean, talk about an unusual situation. But you can do that. I mean, you call on a prospective customer, they've got the competitor's product there, and you just ask them, how are you using that? And what else would you need that it doesn't do? And then to my way of thinking, I want to know who the people are inventing those. Not just what did they build, but why did they build it? What's in their head? What vision are they chasing? And so I spent a fair amount of time with professional societies and public forums, if you will, trying to get to know my competitors as people. Who are they? What wakes them up at night? And that sometimes can give you a tremendous insight for where your competitive pressures are going to come. So that's that one. The ask why all the time, that's just the basic curiosity thing. The 4-year-old comes up, why is the sky blue? Well, because. Why? Where does the sky stop? Well, where is heaven? A 4-year-old can drive you wild with that. But you almost need that questioning capability, that curiosity for new visions because no one knows. Where does this lead? So when we got thrust in the Pisces business, for example, there were 30 companies already in the market. We didn't even know what the word meant. So we couldn't buy a dictionary that would tell you, but we had to ask customers, what are you doing with this thing? Well, it's an emulator. "Oh, emulate what?" So we had to learn a vocabulary and all of that. But having done so, then the question is, well, what would be a contribution in that world and why? And so you hear a bunch of things, and your team is bringing back these partial threads. And that's where this number 5 comes in. Iterate like crazy. We built some prototypes. We actually built 4 major prototype differences, and we tried them on people. We sent them out to a potential customer. We had the advantage we could use HP divisions as potential customers, and they wouldn't be fiercely antagonistic. And so you'd keep the features that worked and you'd throw the features away that didn't work. I wrote a book about Hewlett-Packard history a few years ago for Stanford Press. I could tout the book, but the key thing about the book is my co-author and I thought we understood HP pretty well. We wrote a 500-page manuscript and passed it to like 10 of our trusted friends at HP. Almost uniformly, they said, this is bullshit. I mean, they said, you're telling your story. You're not telling the Hewlett Packard story. Well, how would you come at that? Well, so we interviewed 500 people and coalesced a story out of that. The next version we wrote read like a high school yearbook. It was about the dullest thing. It was factual. Here's what happened, and then in June this, and then in September this. Well, who the hell's going to read that? So the third pass, 7 years later, we got a manuscript that we felt had some heft and some excitement to read it, and pass the muster of the HP people who said, "Wow, this does capture the corporation." So the iterate like crazy works not just in product design, but in all sorts of things.
And Chuck, I wanted to pull out a few of those because I'll come back to a couple of them. But this one, while we're on Iterate like crazy, I'm sure with your book as well, you had to actually delete some chapters, and some chapters you're like kind of going, "Oh, I think I should have that, but I can't." But this also applies then to entrepreneurship because you say entrepreneurs have to be able to kill their own ideas, and
Absolutely.
that is really tough. You did it well with with the Dwook, but it is a difficult thing to do.
Well, I mean, when you're writing a book, that problem hits you all the time. When you're doing interviews, I mean, I call them PIP interviews, previously important people. I've interviewed almost 1,000 people for the Computer History Museum, for IEEE, for ACM. I did it for the Cisco Foundation, and you have an hour to 2 hours with people, and you're choosing as the interviewer, and they're choosing as the interviewee what to say and what not to say. And volumes get left on the table. It's like editing a film. The outtakes are sometimes the most interesting.
On that, Chuck, like one of the things I find very frustrating is like you were saying how in depth these interviews are. What mostly happens is you'll get sent a book and you'll get sent a list of questions to ask the author. And I kind of find it a little bit insulting that somebody else will send me what they think is important from the book versus when you read a lot, you know this.
Oh yeah,
I can see your shelves there behind you for those people looking at us on YouTube. When you read a lot, you end up activating different parts of what's relevant, but what's also relevant to your audience then versus what someone else thinks is relevant. And I think that's the key thing. And it's like everything in life when you have a bit more experience.
yeah. Those bookshelves, by the way, are fairly empty because we're packing to move, and we just culled 600 textbooks of histories of this company and that company and all. I mean, I've been an inveterate collector of all this stuff, but
I'm
yeah.
sure it's probably worth a fortune. But you were saying about the idea of being consistently curious, and we'll come back to that about asking why all the time. And this was rule number 4, ask why all the time. But one of the things, and I'm just linking in some of the book here, some of the stories you shared was, remember the time you went to a customer and you weren't at the customer for this reason, but you were looking at their scopes and there was missing parts, and you stopped to inquire and kind of go, what's going on here? Why is there several parts being removed? And they explained that it didn't work the way they wanted it to without removing them, and this led to a huge insight for your display box.
Yeah, that was one of those epiphany moments. I'm on the tour to see this stuff at a military provider, and usually you don't get into those kind of environments, but I was allowed in. It wasn't confidential, but it was a privileged opportunity. Pieces of equipment, these Tektronix scopes, are sitting there with blank panels or actually just holes in the panels. And what the hell? These look incomplete. What happened? And they said, well, those parts got in the way of the measurement, and they had some dielectric coefficients that were changing with humidity and whatever. I don't remember the detail, but they knew the detail had to be fixed by removing the parts. And I go, well, why did you do that? And how'd that work? And did you talk to Tektronix? Well, why would we talk to them? We were solving our problem. And a year and a half later, we had almost analogous case on the display system, which was not at all what I was out there for or had even thought about, at the time. And I remembered this thing, and you go, oh my God, so that was a key insight to simplifying a product that we wanted to appeal to people that weren't buying oscilloscopes, but they just needed a display.
And this idea of just getting outside the building, you were a huge believer in this, and we'll talk about this later on when you fund your entrepreneurs and get them outside the building. But I wanted to link it to the idea of know your competitors because, again, by you say one of the best ways to know your competitors is to actually hang out and know and love your own customers because they'll tell you about your competitors, what they're doing wrong, what they're doing right, what they're trying to solve, and they won't even realize that they're doing so in many cases. I thought that was a
Yeah.
really important point.
Well, we had the advantage that HP was a terrific competitor. We were known for building high quality instrumentation, and so our ethics were never questioned. Our credibility wasn't questioned, and Tektronix was the same way. And so people treated us almost as instrument consultants. And so it was a very natural thing to ask, well, what aren't they doing? Well, if they had this, but we can't persuade them to do it. Oh, really? Listen up. This could be good. But I find that, we did some work 5 or 6 years ago around the COVID pandemic and almost instantly found that epidemiologists, people who study disease transmission and whatnot, are very familiar with statistical forms that I'll call them geospatial maps. Choropleth is the word they go by. They knew all about that. They knew about the value of per capita pictures. The public health officials know none of that. And so what was happening is the public health officials are talking to the TV channels about where these diseases are happening, and they gave you absolute numbers. And what happened was Los Angeles, New York, London, Paris, Madrid all looked bad. Okay. Dublin actually looked pretty bad too. And so they would show these maps of where the hot spots were as judged by total number of cases. And it turns out, most of rural America had no problem whatsoever. Most of anywhere rural had no. But if you did it on a per capita basis, the worst places in the world was a place in Lombardy, Italy, a place in northern Spain, and North Dakota and South Dakota in America. And you go, really? Well, so here's the problem. We've shown on television for 6 or 8 weeks where the problem is, as shown by the absolute. And then the governors all put in lockdowns. This happened by nations all over the world. We need a lockdown. We need a lockdown on all of Italy. Huh? What do you mean? Out here in the boondocks, we're not having a problem. Well, you are if you see this map. So they belatedly show the maps. And it turns out everybody said, oh, you're showing us maps to defend your decision. Those are fake maps. So you have this blowback from people, and it didn't need to be that way. And so my point there basically is you've got to be conversant with the data and you've got to understand the issue in the terms that are going to be meaningful for the recipient. And I think your opening there really spoke to that.
There's a great line that the map is not the territory. That whole idea of
Yeah.
just get out.
Oh,
So
I had a gal one time, I was giving a commencement speech in Utah, of all places, and a bunch of PhDs. And their question was, and I was espousing that getting a wider perspective is crucial to understanding your situation for innovation. And, and that travel was a great way to do that. And some gal raised her hand and said, "Well, I'm from Uzbekistan, and I might be pronouncing that wrong, but I'm from one of the stands, and I'm here now in Utah. I went through London in order to get over here. Where should I travel?" And I said, "Have you been to China?" And she said, "No, but I've read books about it. I've watched films about it. I know about China." And I said, "Well, let me ask this. When you were in Uzbekistan or London and you read about the United States, was that the same as when you got here?" "Oh, no,
I
not at
have a
all."
postcard. I have a postcard. I've been there. It may as well be there. So, Chuck, we'll get back to the list. So, the last one we have, because we did seven, is number six, and you referred to this earlier on. This is to use your team. And what you say here is teams come in many sizes and they may or may not be co located. And with your XY display team, it was quite small, and each member contributed heavily to the definitions, possible users, specs, etc., etc. And each member of the DWOC team contributed features that the next team, the digital scope team, spent considerable time validating and refining before dismissing some ideas and pursuing others. But you talk here about how when the team grows bigger, you may have to start even flipping into educating them a bit more. Maybe sales teams, like you said before, that you have to activate the sales team. You need them on side.
I think the point of that, for me, the use your team showed up most when I was doing Pisces. As I said, we wound up using product capability, technology really, from 14 divisions. I hadn't been to 14 divisions. I didn't know which ones to use, and no one else did either. Everybody knew two or three divisions. And so they're out traveling and they've got a partial view of our vision. These are my team. And they would bring those back and they would try and feed in what they understood from division A or division C or whatever to how it might, gel with something else. And my point there about using the team was unless you had that team basically operating the same way you do, knowing what's out there, doing their market research, asking why, you couldn't stitch something like that together. I didn't realize it at the time, but I was encouraging others to be entrepreneurial on our behalf. And I think the bottom line here, Aidan, is if you give people power to have input, it's so galvanizing. I've had people say, I brought the keyboards in for Pisces. They don't identify with all of Pisces, but I brought the keyboards in, Fort Collins division or from Singapore division, or wherever it came from. And they have ownership. What you're building is a loyalty based on participation. It's the difference between listening to the teacher in class versus you giving a segment.
That's a really important point for entrepreneurs. They want to be involved. They actually, they may seem like they're naysayers or they're disgruntled, but actually it's probably a form of ADHD where it's like, I'm actually much more active when I'm involved and I'm involved in the decision making, etc. I often think that, Chuck. But I wanted to show on our screen the seven. So this is what we covered: make a contribution, do your own market research, know your competitors, ask why all the time, iterate like crazy, use your team, and honor your bosses. But there's another one, and I'm going to let you I love this one. This one is Carpe Diem, seize the day.
I mean, there's no time like the present. You can have great ideas, and then someone else introduces your product. That'd be that's a downer.
It goes a bit deeper than that though, Chuck. I loved what you said here. It's like you mentioned Gifford Pinchot again here, and he said, "Come to work every day willing to be fired." And you certainly did that.
Well, I never thought of it that way. I was on the Jane Pauley show, the Today Show, and I said I didn't think about it as being liable to be fired. I thought of it as I was doing the best job for the company that I could. And I wasn't worried about my boss. I was worried about the company. Didn't always endear me to the boss, so that's why I had to put that honor your boss's point in there.
But you did say that you struggled with that all the time, all throughout your life. And later on, you actually say, and this is a nice segue to get us into the entrepreneur side, because you say being an entrepreneur is much easier, you concluded, than being a manager of one.
Oh,
So
no question.
you're showing empathy here for actually, well, those poor guys have to manage somebody like me. But that insight helped you then build the entrepreneuring manager's playbook, which fuels the last chapter of the book. So we're going to do this. And then we're going to do a last episode where we're going to share some of the tools that Chuck has developed. And in particular, he's been inspired, hopefully partly by this, Chuck, to write more of the book, to actually do an updated version as well with new rules, new tools. And we're going to give you a little hint of that, little tip of the hat to the future in the next episode. But let's get into these, Chuck.
Sure.
The first is to develop the vision and mission before strategy and tactics.
Well, yeah. So we've shifted to the entrepreneurial manager side. So I think the issue I had going on in my own mind as we moved to Pisces was I had brought for the displays business, for the logic analyzer business, I was a key part of the set of ideas that we embodied. So I had some of the original vision, maybe most of the original vision. I'll say some of it, and I was carrying out my ideas, if you will, in these products. Okay, Pisces, we were told to do it, and in particular, being told to do they weren't my ideas at all. I didn't know. I didn't know the field. I didn't have any perspective on the field, but we're being told to do it. And the question now, given that I've got a number of entrepreneurs I've trained, working for me, and we're going to be assigned to this thing we don't know anything about, we can use they can all use the entrepreneur's rules, but I can't. I have to manage them in a situation that I don't understand, and I don't feel good because I'm not able to contribute anything technically. So what's my role? And I almost had an identity crisis. And as I reflected on it, and this might have taken more years than I'm going to describe here, I realized that I had moved to becoming a manager of entrepreneurs and not an entrepreneur myself. And that the rules that I had to guide them by were radically different than the rules I used as an entrepreneur. So that's where this list came from. And as time has gone on, I've realized this is the piece we don't teach anybody. We don't teach we teach how to be a manager to schedules and targets and costs and features. And, you've got Gantt charts and PERT charts and agile technology and the lean design skills. And I mean, we tout all that, and we teach that in the business schools and in the technology schools. But we don't teach how to manage these mavericks on these things that are truly, breakthrough and contributing, where they're running up against the same obstacles I ran up against. So that's where this list came from. And to say you have to develop the mission and vision first is you have to have some idea where you're trying to go before you can decide how to guide somebody to go there, right? This sort of sounds intuitively obvious, but it's crucial to have a sense. In our case, we got the advantage. Palo Alto told us where you're going to go. You're going to go into this emulation field because there's these other 30 companies, and in particular, one of them is kicking our butt. Okay. What they didn't say was how to do it. They said, this is where we want you to go. So the mission and the vision is go conquer that world. We have no idea how to do it. We're pretty sure you can figure that out. Okay. But if we didn't have that guidepost, we wouldn't have known what to work on. So that's why that's first. And then the question is, who wants to sign up for that? I mean, we've got a lot of people happy with logic analyzers. We're now king of the hill, small hill, but we're king of the hill, and we love it. And most of my players had been part of that 3 or 4 year tour to become king of the hill. And so you say, who wants to volunteer for a whole new assignment in an area none of us know anything about? And about 4 people stood forward. Out of by then we had maybe 40, and so 10% raised their hand, and so identifying them was pretty easy. They'd been rabble rousers on the last group. What we really ought to be doing is that kind of. When I married a girl 40 years ago, who's a PhD out of Berkeley in computer science, very smart lady, very accomplished. She's actually working on a documentary about some of her life in computer education circles. But she several times said, why do you have this guy on your staff? What a pain in the ass he is. Or, she had different words, but, this guy is a total jerk or irritant, and he's driving you wild. Why do you put up with that? And the answer is, he's my key entrepreneur. Without him, we wouldn't have those innovative juices. And he provokes the team, he provokes me. And the problem is, he's usually right. I'd rather have him than have him on the competitor team. So that's the identify your key entrepreneurs.
It's a really key point, I think, that they're not wired. I would say put myself in there as well. You're not wired the same. You see the world differently. Also, you feel you have to speak up. When I was in those roles, I felt I was being false to myself, and I was holding back, and I'd feel like a part of me was rotting
Yeah.
if I didn't tell the truth.
Well, like that, the example I had in the book about the gal that IBM bought their company. How's it going? Well, I show up, I check my brain at the door. What an awful thing to say. And this gal was like 27 years old, obviously bright as a whip. I should go look her up these days. I have a story about someone like that. I ran a college a digital arts college about 12 or 14 years ago, and we were first rate building movies from digital capability. And it doesn't matter how I got them together, but I got the whole group together, and I said, we are getting a new teacher and a couple new teachers and some new people. We can add some new courses. What would you like? And this was maybe 2011. We'd like to do swarming robots, and we'd like to do some artificial intelligence, early actually machine learning stuff, and we'd love to do some high security stuff. Okay, so we went through all that, and then one gal in the front of the row, and I'd never heard her say anything, African American young lady, and always so shy and painfully shy. And she raised her hand and said, "I'd like more math." And I said, well, really? And the whole room was like, oh, come on, lady. I said, what would you like? And she said, I'd like conformal mapping and convolution integrals. And I hadn't heard those words in 50 years. Those are 2 of the 3 small C's of calculus. And I said, well, how about celestial mechanics? She said, I don't need that. And so anyway, then the question of my provost was asked, I want to know by Friday why she wants those 2 things. And it turned out it had to do with keeping her avatar dressed when he jumped, huh? The shirt stayed on the bench when he jumped to save a friend.
Wow.
But the sequel is this. So No one in the class knew who she was. She asked that. She wound up being the star of the class. She went from there to Tesla, and she won the Intel Grand Challenge. And now she's at where is she? She's at Google doing, and she's 30 years old. I mean, there was an entrepreneur in training, just going at it. So it's easy to identify them sometimes.
And as we'll talk about in a moment, you have to empower them as well. So number 3, and this one, I thought it's the least intuitive of them. Define your development and speculative portfolio. And the question you ask here is, how do you help your entrepreneurs to get more grounded? Well, include them in your strategic planning meetings, empowering them to put their ideas forward in a group setting, just like that lady you mentioned.
So what I thought there are two things that drive that point. The first is section 4, which we haven't really discussed. And we discussed it a little bit, I guess, in the last session. But the point is, you can think in terms of a project. You can think in terms of a program has multiple projects in it, and a strategic cycle has multiple programs in it. And so there's a time sequence to these and they unfold, but there's a lot of things that happen in a portfolio. Okay. And so what happens if you've got these entrepreneurs bouncing around with great ideas? Not every idea can be pursued in the first round. And so one way I dealt with it, once we had a big enough team that this mattered, is you would essentially, I won't say pigeonhole, but you would position ideas, that'll work in phase 1. This will work better in phase 2. And so you design a portfolio of introductions around a strategic cycle. So what we did with Pisces was we have to master two things. The controller mechanism. We're going to have multiple terminals. Is it going to be a master controller or can it be a shared control system? And how do we tie the advantage of all of the peripherals of HP, disk drives and printers and all that, in to make a coherent system? So that's phase 1. Phase 2 is, what emulators are you going to tackle? And phase 3 is, what ancillary tools are you going to put around the emulators so that this becomes essentially a design to customer support environment? And so, what you do when you build a portfolio plan like that is you give different people who have different ideas, some of which are pretty fledgling, aren't very well thought out. You give them a place in the pantheon of what you're doing that they can feel they're part of, even though they're not part of today quite in terms of the product itself.
I just thought it probably needed a bit more description for our audience because it's not as succinct as have a vision. But again, it's a similar thing where you said you'll be surprised how many people are not on the same page as you of what our vision. Some people don't think we have a vision at all, but it's the same with your strategic portfolio. And by
Right.
helping them understand you're all on the same page, just aligns all that energy in the same place, which is nice lead up for the next one, which is to select strategic program and project leadership very carefully. This is number 4.
The leadership you're going to, if it's a big program, if it's a strategic cycle kind of program, the leaders you want to pick are not just entrepreneurs themselves. They have to have some leadership skills of the type that they can empower other entrepreneurs underneath them. So it's kind of a 3-phase thing. I'm going to manage entrepreneurs, but I'm also going to manage some people that I'm training to be leaders of entrepreneurs. And the problem you have with a lot of entrepreneurs being managed by people who aren't good at it is they turn them off. Well, you can imagine for a sizable program, if you pick leaders that between you and the entrepreneurs who turn them off, you've basically just shot yourself. And so the question is, can you find leadership who understand both of these charts? Can you develop one? Can you pick people from the intrapreneurship charts who can learn the skills of the entrepreneur leadership parts? And so that's what I mean by select your leadership carefully. And And it's tough because, well, first of all, as I've mentioned before, no one teaches this. So it's not a learned skill in the sense that you went to class, you know, and it has to do as much as anything with trying to ask engineers and very creative engineers to become, subtle managers of people. You got to be kidding. They became engineers so they wouldn't have to deal with people.
That's such a key thing as well. Like, we were talking about how in the bowels of HP, for example, you'd have equivalent to today. If they had headphones back then, they'd have their headphones on. There'd be no
Yeah,
communication going on. But it's actually the communication that is absolutely key. But on this, I just wanted to point out a couple of things here. You said two typical mistakes occur with this rule. First, too many executive teams fail to distinguish project leadership from program leadership
right.
skills. And secondly, almost all project managers, and for that matter, most program managers, will naturally manage tightly to prescribed schedules and cost goals. And it almost goes without saying that the rest of the executive team and the CEO will have this short term incremental approach. Those things, they're not throwaway points. Those things can actually be the life or death of a project.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And at one level, it almost sounds like I'm saying you don't need to worry about those kinds of things. You need to worry about more of the free spirit, intimate things. But at the same time, the rubber hits the road when the product ships. And so I don't want to be disdainful of that. For Pisces, we were on a tight schedule and we had this insane set of competitors out there. And our leader got in a serious automobile accident. Actually, he was on a motorcycle and a truck hit him. And he was fortunate to live. He did not survive it in the sense that his brain was intact. So we basically lost a good share of his leadership forever. But he did live and fathered kids and had a successful life later, fortunately. But the point was, we were hosting a meeting that day of people from all around the world that were going to be the sales force. And we had a projected date to ship that happened to be, we know the date, September 11th was the World Trade Center day. So we didn't know it was going to be, but it gave us, we were the first people to say September 11th is a big deal. The second in command on the project stood in front of these people, knowing that his boss was critically injured and may not survive, and said, "We're going to meet that date." And everybody's, "You got to be kidding." And we met that date. We had to prune some functionality to do it, but we met the date, we got the product out, and we started selling the day we had told them a year before. And so there's one where the date mattered. So I don't want to be disdainful of targets and schedules and things like that.
You definitely aren't, man. I think that's key as well. And we'll talk about that in the next episode when we talk about how to actually measure a project and return maps, etc. as well. But the next one is fund your entrepreneurs fully. And we alluded to this one earlier on. I'll tee you up here. You say entrepreneurs need little funding in the traditional sense. Tooling charges, major capital investments, sizable marketing investments, and sales promotions costs are not the issue here, as indeed they are usually are for corporations' main products. The issue is that the entrepreneur needs different spending formats: travel money, investigative money, consulting help, going to events, going to trade shows, and there's no line item, there's no way to even sometimes recoup for those expenses. I know a lot of entrepreneurs who'll actually pay for stuff out of their own pocket because there's no way to do so through the organization, but they'll still do it because they know it's right for the organization, which is so wrong. But this is a key point.
You see that in public education. Teachers buy the pencils for their kids, the pencils and paper. And I mean, it's stunning what society does and doesn't support sometimes, or corporations. But yeah, so fun. The example I have in the book that brought me up short was I had a team. In fact, the manager of of that little gal I described that wanted conformal mapping. He said, I'd like three, and this had been a guy working on Avatar 1. You may have seen Avatar 2. Avatar 1 was Jim Cameron as the lead guy. This was his number 2 guy, was our faculty lead for building these movies. Terrible man. And he said, I need $20,000 to go to SIGGRAPH with 3 of my best students. I want to inspire them with the best people in computer science in the world doing computer graphics. Okay. And what's it worth to inspire somebody, right? And we didn't have 20 grand. And so I took it to the staff. I was chancellor, and I took it to the faculty stance, and they said, oh, there's no way, you know. And like an idiot, I go back to him and I say, there's no way. My personnel manager is following me out of the room, and she says, hey, Chuck, she says, aren't you writing a book, the book we're talking about? Aren't you writing a book about how to fund entrepreneurs? Yeah, I am. She says, you just blew it, buddy.
I was only writing about that earlier on, Chuck. I actually, because I read about that, because you mentioned that in the last episode, but I actually read about it since then. And I thought about that, plus your experience with Thomas Kuhn, the paradigm shift guy, who couldn't take a
Oh,
paradigm
yeah.
shift when you challenged him about a paradigm shift. But I told you the last episode as well that also this guy, Howard Gardner, who created this concept of multiple intelligences, he met Stanley Milgram, who talked about speaking truth to power. And he was in Harvard and he questioned Milgram, and Milgram lost it with him.
Oh, yeah. Yeah,
And I
it's,
was remember we were saying you gave me the saying, it's hard to see the picture when you're inside the
yeah.
frame.
I had that with Tom Kuhn, the paradigm guy, and he missed one. Well, so the sequel here was we did fund the 3 people. I went on the trip myself. I said, I want to see it. Here's the sequel to the sequel. Coming out of that, I was inspired to start a new company, which is what we're running now, doing multiple displays because of that SIGGRAPH visit. Huh? I mean, who would have
Incredible.
thought? Talk about eat the dog food, buddy.
But you actually point out there, and you do say this, that is why you wrote this book,
Yeah.
because companies do it. We all do it. There's a book there I have called Mistakes Are Made, But Not by Me. It's a great book. I'm trying to see it because the cover is fantastic. The cover is upside down on purpose.
Okay.
And the whole idea is that you there's a thing called the fundamental attribution bias where, say for example, you're driving home and some guy cuts you off on the motorway to take the off ramp. You're like, beep beep, jackass, right? But then you're rushing home because you need to bring the dogs for a walk or bring them to the vet. And you'll go, oh yeah, but I have to bring the dogs
Yeah,
to
I
the
have
vet.
to. Yeah, you got it.
And the exact same thing. This is it. You cannot be objective with yourself. It's so difficult. So you cannot read the label when you're inside the jar. You can't see the picture when you're inside the frame. And it's one of the reasons I'm so grateful to you for taking time to write the book, but also to do a deep dive on the book. But we didn't do Empower.
Funding is a subset of Empower. Okay. To fund the guy for the SIGGRAPH thing, I just write him a check. Okay, so I'm funding him, and a lot of what entrepreneurs look for is funding. But what you really look for is empowering, meaning that you can choose your own agenda. You can choose whether to go to SIGGRAPH or trip visits to customers. You can choose whether to spend your money on hiring a consultant that isn't ordinarily done. At HP, after I got in that corporate engineering job, I had a meeting somewhere and we met Doug Engelbart, the creator of the mouse and actually some of the first work that led to Xerox PARC. And I said, hey, I met you 17 years ago. You used my display for something. And he kind of remembered. And then I said, what? And he was working for, I don't know, McDonnell Douglas or somebody in a dumb shit role. And I said, his company had been bought, and that kind of thing. And I said, what would it take to hire you as a consultant for this project I'm doing at HP? And he said, well, and had a way. And all of a sudden, I have like one of the more famous guys in Silicon Valley working on how to build the HP communication system. It blew everybody. How did you get that? Well, I was empowered. And that's what they said. How did you get the power to hire him? And I said, I didn't know that was a question worth asking. I mean, I just took it for granted I had that power. But most people don't take it for granted. And so empowering is a much broader thing than funding. And I just wanted to make that point.
Thank
Okay.
you. And that's number 6. Let's bring it home, Chuck. Let's bring it home.
Number 7, redefine your program reviews. So up until then, I had pretty much run all the reviews, and we ran them for local management. But with Pisces now, our constituents are Palo Alto, and they're not local. And our constituents are the computer sales force as opposed to the instrument sales force. And so the question is, you ought to provide reviews for them so that they can know what you're doing and so that they can essentially help audit and help guide what you're doing, right? That's the purpose of a review. Well, they would come in and they would ask questions from their frame of reference, but the frame of reference would derail our program. I mean, they didn't know what they were supposed to ask, is the right way to say it. And so I had to write a set of rules for what does it mean to do a program review versus a project review versus a strategic review, and what questions are allowed and what questions are not allowed in each of those. And if somebody asks a question that's going to derail the meeting, you can say, excuse me, that's a project review question. We're going to deal with that in September or something like that. It took a lot of coaching for people that had never been told what to do in a review, who loved the power of being a reviewer. And that was one of the things I discovered also was the ego that goes with becoming an auditor or a reviewer. It's a very powerful position. And we don't have any rules for how to do it. And you go, bullshit, man. You're going to come into my territory and wreck my program because you have a different view. So we had to structure that in a way that they could be helpful as opposed to hurtful. And they weren't trying to be malicious. It was just, they just didn't know. So that's why I spent time on that.
And there's, as you say, like they cannot be measured the same. You say here, traditional program reviews are built for sustaining businesses,
Right.
incremental stuff, the iPhone 17.
Yeah.
So they emphasize schedules, forecasts, and delivery against plan. The logic breaks down for entrepreneurial work. For example, like you said about Apple, speculative programs require different review discipline, one that recognizes uncertainty rather than punishing it. I thought about this, Chuck. This one really got me thinking because I was thinking about how, I don't know if you know this, but when Apple did the Apple One and the Apple Two, the Apple One didn't sell that many. I think it was somebody, it was a small number, like 500 or something like that. And they were delighted. This is when it was the old wooden case, etc. Wozniak and Jobs delighted with this, got huge rewards for this. But because they had no schedule to meet or they didn't know how many they'd sell, etc., they were delighted. But then later on, when Apple IPO'd after the second Mac, after the second Apple, they then were under totally different observation
Right.
and the whole company changed. And with the Newton,
Yeah.
when they created the Newton, they sold loads of the Newton, but they didn't sell what they expected to sell. So it was seen as this massive failure in the company. And you go, how is that possible when it's a brand new product? And this is a thing, it's the context, isn't it, that kills so many ideas.
Well, so I gave the example in one of our talks about the 16.6 million goal, and we hit 12, and it was a massive failure. I did a study of Apple with the iPod. The iPod was basically a gamble by Jobs. He was really having trouble reviving Apple when he came back. He went 7 years before he made profit coming back. Isaacson left that completely out of the biography. but but the point was he had this passion for music. And so he built the iPod and his forecasts were, I've forgotten what they were, but they were up and to the right and it was going to go to like a million. a year kind of thing. Well, the first 3 months were on target and then it leveled off. But he has the second version in development. And people within the company were urging him to drop that. The thing didn't work. He said, no, it'll work. The second one came out and he made forecasts of like 4 million for this thing. It goes up to about 1.5 million and flattened. And now, what are you going to do next? And he said, what I'm going to do next is the nano. And they, why are you beating this drum? Well, the sales promptly went to 40 million or whatever the hell it was. I mean, he got it right the third time. And the laserjet printer was that way. It was the fourth product by the same project leader over a decade. The other three had all failed miserably, and they still gave him money to do the fourth one. And he said, and I could just see the meeting. I've got it this time. Trust me, I've got it this time. And they
Yeah,
trusted him.
probably had no choice. There's so much in that Apple story that we just don't know what was going on. I
Oh,
mean,
yeah.
because the history's written by the victors. I'm sure Isaacson was like, "Oh no, no, don't put that in. Put that in. Don't put that."
Well, yeah. Steve actually did a fair amount of the editing on Isaacson's book. And Steve had no room for talking about troubles that he'd had along the way.
Absolutely. Well,
No, I
Chuck,
came close to writing an Apple book at one point, but I thought, I'll leave that to other people.
we're doing a series up next after this series with you on Nokia, and I got like massive inside track on Nokia, the papers into Nokia, the original spec document that was done by a team inside Nokia a year before the iPhone came out, and how accurate they were. I have a copy. I'll happily send it to you. They were so accurate about the iPhone coming out. And even despite all this, there was so many problems inside Nokia with just communication and thinking people had it, people afraid to speak up and go, no, we're not making progress against these deadlines at all, that the whole thing comes tumbling down. I'd say you'd really like it. I'm happy to send you on the papers if you like.
What's the nature of the papers? Are they proprietary?
No, there were two. There's a guy called Kui Hui and Timo Furi, and they wrote these papers. They actually did interviews with middle managers and top managers across Nokia afterwards, and in
Kind of a
a
postmortem?
post, yeah, like a post mortem. And actually, you love what they called one of the papers they wrote. They said it was called "Who Killed Nokia?" Nokia did.
Oh, well, I said that I was part of this Motorola thing. So I had a chapter in this book that you're touting or that we're, going into. I had three more chapters in it when I first published it. And they covered, among other things, Apple and the Motorola music experience, a couple of other things. And when I had the book reviewed by a bunch of my colleagues, they said, this is two books. You ought to separate that second piece out. And I've never published that second piece. And what I'm just juices that you've gotten flowing for me again, that could be pretty interesting. And if I had the Apple, so there's three pieces: the Apple iPod and the Apple iPhone. There's and you mentioned the pre, or you didn't mention the pre, but you mentioned the oh shit, help me.
The
Well, you mentioned the Newton, but before that, you had said uh, the
Nokia.
no,
Oh, the Palm Pilot
yeah, the
was it?
Palm Pilot. So my team built the Palm Pilot OS.
Wow.
Among other things. I got on national television because of it, and I walked in to the studio up in San Francisco, and the co-founder of the other team was there, and she said, "What are you doing here?" And I said, "I built your operating system." You did? But the point is, and then the Apple phone team went over and did the pre. I don't know if you know that.
Didn't know that.
So the point is, you could meld all of those stories together around, what were the precursors to the iPhone? How did it work? How did its competitors see it? And how did even later competitors try? And, I mean, it'd be a delicious little monograph.
I really would. And did one of the things I kind of understood from the Newton was the Newton was essentially the raw material that became. I always think about it like compost. It was the compost that became the iPhone or the iPad, perhaps.
The way I see the Newton actually was the precursor to the Palm Pilot.
Oh, right, okay.
Yeah,
The Newton, the
the
Apple.
lineage is from it to the Palm Pilot, and the thing they solved was how to do the characters.
Oh, okay.
The problem the Newton had was you had to write in a prescribed way, and nobody could learn the alphabet basically, because it was almost symbolic, but they were on the right track, and there were several iterations in the meantime, but the Palm Pilot, particularly with the automatic feed, which destroyed your phone bill, but the automatic update stuff. That then was the first of and actually the predecessor to both of those was the HP handhelds,
Wow,
the
wow.
calculator. The reason we got the bid to do the OS for the Palm Pilot was because we had done the tools for the HP 35.
Cool, man. Cool. And so are you gonna write a book?
Send me the stuff and I'll see whether we
Yeah, yeah.
can.
Happily. I've recorded with the guys, so I have loads of papers. I have and actually the guy who wrote the strategy paper about the iPhone, he's gonna come on the show and talk about that as well, but talk about the experience. Because what I want to ask him was what actually happened behind closed doors of you trying to tell the company we're in serious trouble here and what actually happened.
The other in that thread was the BlackBerry.
Yeah, yeah.
So yeah,
We have the lady. There's a lady who wrote the book. Have you seen this series on Netflix? Or it might be actually on Apple, but Jackie. Oh, what's Jackie's name? I'll tell you now. Jackie Mac. It's like an Irish name. Jackie Mac. Jackie McNish. So she wrote the book about BlackBerry, and we're going to cover that as well next year. So I want to cover the stories where they're just these myths that are thrown away, but nobody goes into actually what happened behind the scenes. And that's what I was telling Steve Sasson about you, and he'd love to come on and do an episode with you. Steve Sasson's the guy who created the Kodak camera inside Kodak
okay,
when he was a
okay.
23-year-old engineer. And he kept going around going, "This is going to kill us. This is going to kill us." And everybody just shutting him down the whole time. I thought you guys would be able to share some war
Yeah.
stories.
Well, one of the things that I know I've noticed a lot, there's a fair number of books about a given product or a given company. There are very few books that weave the story of multiple companies competing. In other words, it's easier to capture all of the Apple story from iPod, to iPhone than it is to capture Apple versus Motorola versus, you know, BlackBerry versus Finland and so forth, right? But what you're in a place to do is capture that. And it's that interplay, to me, the interplay between tech and Intel and HP around these logic things is a much more compelling story than what happened with logic.
Exactly.
I mean, that is a high school yearbook story.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, just narrating it isn't interesting. It's actually the emotional journey.
Yeah,
The stuff you shared in this book. It's like how difficult it is to change the paradigm,
yeah,
and how just flawed we are as humans to let it just drift. And like that's just one of the foibles of being a human.
oh yeah. Well, whether
Yeah,
I'd ever write a book, again, I mean, I'll probably write 3 or 4 more books if I get, God willing. But whether that'll make the list, it's hard to say, But I'd love to
that's it.
see the
Well,
material.
we'll fuel it for you, brother. We'll fuel it for you.
Okay,
Well, listen, it's been a pleasure. We're going to do part four. Chuck and I are going to record part four before Christmas as well. So these two episodes will go out before Christmas. But for now, author of Permission Denied and the Intrapreneurial Rulebook, The Seven Rules, and the Entrepreneur's Manager's Rulebook, Chuck House, thank you for joining
you
us.
bet. Thank you. Take care.
Thanks again to our sponsor, Kyndryl, who runs and reimagines the technology systems that drive advantage for the world's leading businesses. With a unique blend of AI powered consulting built on unmatched managed service capability, Kyndryl helps leaders harness the power of technology for smarter decisions, faster innovation, and a lasting competitive edge. You can find so many previous guests from the Innovation Show: Sanjeet Paul Chowdhury, Rita McGrath, many others on the Kyndryl.com/institute. It's the anniversary of that institute. It's packed full of great thought leaders. Don't forget, you can download the app as well and subscribe to content there. You can find that at Kyndryl.com/institute.